diplomacy will be the vanguard of our foreign policy. This is not a radical idea. The ancient Roman Terence declared, in every endeavor, seemly course for wise men is to try persuasion first. The same truth, Hilary said, binds wise women as well. While there is some debate regarding whether the term smart power was coined by another wise woman, Suzanne Nozzle, a former colleague of mine at Amnesty International, executive director, or Joseph Nye, who of course coined the term soft power in the first place and clarified the combination of soft and hard power as smart power in 2004, Secretary of State Clinton's articulation of the vanguard of this new foreign policy was innovative and bold. For whether one uses the old term multilateralism, robust diplomacy, liberal interventionism, or the exercise of smart power, the logic is that no single strategy is effective in an environment of asymmetrical and existential threats to U.S. national security interests. All the tools articulated by Secretary of State Clinton, diplomatic, economic, military, political, legal, and cultural, belong in the arsenal of a hegemonic superpower, particularly one that has been suffering a loss of its moral authority due to an over-reliance on hard power, whether of a conventional nature in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, or with the 21st century non-conventional drones. Indeed, the use of the latter poses major challenges with respect to their conformity or lack thereof to international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and challenges, I would argue, regarding how smart their power is versus the damage that they have done to the soft power of the United States and to the rule of law in general. What the Bush administration labeled transformational diplomacy proved to be neither transformational nor diplomatic, but rather a merely repackaged form of good old American imperialism with a heaping dose of American exceptionalism. Instead of deploying what Nye suggested in his original piece as power with others, as much as power over others, the Bush administration opted for imperialism with the veneer of promoting democracy and fostering human rights. Both wars quickly revealed and continue to reveal in ongoing attacks by insurgencies in both theaters how superficial that veneer was indeed. Many advocates of soft and smart power, with an emphasis on diplomacy and multilateralism, cooperation, contribution to the United Nations efforts at peacemaking, peacekeeping, and converts to the more recent professed commitment to the responsibility to protect, all hoped that the Obama foreign policy agenda would move America back to her professed values and assume that she would renew her place among the community of nations committed to promoting and abiding by the rule of law. That diplomacy would take center stage in her dealings with extremists. In Iran, for example, remember in the Cairo speech, we will extend an open hand to adversaries willing to unclench their fists. That arms control talks would be revived with North Korea, and that America would participate in multilateral armed humanitarian interventions only when they clearly were prescribed by the United Nations Security Council rather than acting unilaterally and extra-constitutionally. The American electorate believed they were voting their principles and conscience in 2009, electing President Obama as a clear denunciation of unilateral, hegemonic, extra-legal interventionism. America's European allies rejoiced, hopeful that America would claim her role as a superpower, not merely due to her military prowess, but with her moral authority intact. You had Ambassador Shmoghi early this morning. I was in Budapest teaching at our campus in Hungary during Obama's inauguration, and the Europeans were just as hopeful and joyous as any of the Americans, and they were ready to forgive anything that had happened in the previous administrations. The Norwegian Nobel Committee clearly shared the European vision for the new Obama administration. In making Obama the 2009 Nobel Peace Prize recipient, Thorbjørn Jagland, chairman of the Nobel Committee, credited the newly elected President Obama with, quote, creating a new climate in international politics, reasserting the position of multilateral diplomacy to a central position with an emphasis on the United Nations. Obama's diplomacy, he gushed, is founded on the concept that those who are to lead the world must do so on the basis of values and attitudes that are shared by the majority of the world's population. Instead, as John Pfeffer forcefully argues in Crusade 2.0, In its actual effect overseas, Obama's version of smart power has been anything but smart. It has maintained imperial overreach, infuriated strategic competitors like China, hardened the position of adversaries like Iran and North Korea, and tried the patience of even long-time allies in Europe and Asia. Not only has the Obama administration continued the disastrous Bush-Cheney programs, such as the incessant drone warfare in Pakistan's tribal borderlands and the covert program to disrupt Iran's nuclear program with computer viruses, but it has amplified them, so much so that, as Pfeffer empirically substantiates, the result has been U.S. military power through unmanned drones in Pakistan and neighboring Afghanistan, as well as Somalia and Yemen. The use of drones and the civilian casualties they've caused has in turn inflamed public opinion around the world. The drone campaign has undermined other smart power approaches, including that old standby diplomacy, not only by antagonizing potential interlocutors, but also by killing a good number of them. Along with the raid that killed Osama bin Laden, often cited as one of Obama's signal accomplishments, the drone war has by now provoked a slow-motion rupture in relations between Washington and Islamabad. Furthermore, the perception of diplomatic overtures toward North Korea or Iran proved to be window dressing as opposed to good old-fashioned diplomacy. For example, vis-a-vis North Korea, the term strategic patience became a euphemism for doing nothing and letting the hawkish leaders in Tokyo and Seoul unravel the previous years of engagement. The new strategic threat of cyber warfare was preemptively deployed, ironically, by the Obama administration, with the Israeli intelligence producing the Sputnik swarm and the flame virus targeting Iran's nuclear program, while Brazil and Turkey were working on a diplomatic approach. Ironically, had the cyber warfare been directed at the United States instead of by the United States, the administration would have considered it an act of war, one of the threats clearly delineated in the Quadrennial Defense Review. Another Obama co-optation of soft power is the newly created Atrocities Prevention Board, headed by Samantha Power, one of the chief architects of U.S. NATO's bombing of Libya. Some of us in the human rights and non-governmental world view that as a conflation of human rights with strategic hard power goals. In Presidential Directive 10 of August 4, 2011, President Obama made the prevention of atrocities a key focus of his administrative foreign policy and what he called a core moral responsibility. The directive delineates a specific soft power diplomatic component whereby, quote, our diplomats will encourage more robust multilateral efforts to prevent and respond to atrocities in which burdens are appropriately shared by other nations, which will require cultivating deeper and broader support among the bilateral partners, as well as international and regional organizations. As Stephen Walt argues on foreignpolicy.com, shortly after President Obama unveiled the Atrocity Prevention Board at the Holocaust Museum, despite the fact that it is hard to imagine objections to such lofty principles, nevertheless, Walt argues it is another manifestation of the American obsession with being a global policeman. Indeed, Walt argues that this is yet another step that will further institutionalize the impulse to intervene. Additionally, he argues that this new directive suffers from the smug self-congratulation that has been a hallmark of the modern American empire. He goes on to note rather poignantly that this new initiative still might look hypocritical to those whose familiarity with the sharp end of American power is extensive, intimate, and unpleasant. It would be easier to take seriously this diplomatic initiative, he argues, if we seemed as concerned by the atrocities that we commit as we are by the crimes of others. The response from the non-governmental organizations and the human rights community, however, was unequivocally positive. Human Rights First applauded the president's initiative as an important step toward institutionalizing the government bureaucracy, mass atrocity prevention response as a goal that they've long embraced. Tom Malinowski at Human Rights Watch welcomed the streamlining of the system, but noted that it won't resolve the difficult question of whether and how the U.S. should respond to a Rwanda-type genocide. Suzanne Nozzle, again my colleague at Amnesty International, then executive director, also hailed the initiative, noting that the ongoing international emergencies we are witnessing in Syria and Sudan remind us of the urgent need to marshal the human rights and technical resources to address complex humanitarian situations before they become crises. While this is consistent with Amnesty International's long-touted prevention strategy that views intervening early as having the potential to save not only lives, but the cost of heavier interventions, it should not be viewed as a blank check for intervention. I would argue, and have within Amnesty, that we should encourage more caution in endorsing interventions merely because they are framed in the language of human rights. The Christian Science monitors, Howard Lafreich, warns, as I do, that the creation of this board represents a victory for the interventionist wing of the Obama foreign policy apparatus, and asks if Obama's new atrocities board will lead to more Libya-style interventions with all the attendant problems. John Bradshaw of the Enough Project warns that the deep-seated tendency to view human rights concern as a distraction, less significant rather than geostrategic interests, is deeply embedded in the Department of State and the Pentagon. The necessary buy-in by the other agencies and departments that are to be involved also raises significant challenge to its effectiveness. Among the myriad of agencies that will be involved are the National Security Council, Department of Defense, Justice, CIA, and Treasury. Many of these departments have deplorable records vis-a-vis human rights. In Humanitarian Imperialism, Using Human Rights to Sell War, Jean Brocquant points out how human rights has been made into a justification for intervention by the world's leading economic and military powers, with the criteria becoming more arbitrary, self-serving, and more destructive each time. James Peck also diagnoses the co-optation of the human rights movement in Ideal Illusions, how the US government co-opted human rights. He notes that the human rights community's widespread support in all kinds of interventions, from democratization to nation building to promoting the rule of law, now risks morphing into a rationale for war itself. Andrew Bukovich has consistently warned about this new American militarism and the evolution of, title of his book, Permanent Warfare State, that delineates as a toxic union of radical right-wing ideology, radical Christian fundamentalism, the ascendancy of robotic and precision weaponry, hypercharged military-industrial complex, and the evolution of a massive for-profit fighting mechanism. In his 2010 book, America's Path to Permanent War, he targets a national security establishment who perpetuate what he calls the Washington rules of global dominance. Included in this is the establishment not only of federal agencies, but a host of satraps such as the defense contractors, banks, think tanks, TV networks, and even some of the universities who helped to create this monolithic narrative. He also targets the sleepwalking American public, who have essentially forfeited any capacity to ask first-order questions about the fundamentals of national security policy. Indeed, violations of international humanitarian law, the laws of war, as well as overt violations of the US Constitution have been rampant, Bukovich notes, that his behavior has paradoxically served as a further mechanism to erode any pre-existing soft power it once possessed. America's moral authority, its legitimate ability to educate, its leadership by example in pushing other countries to adhere to international law, was quickly sacrificed by the deceitful means it used to launch the bombing of Libya, as well as the internationalizing of an endless, ever-expansive global war on terrorism. A particular concern here is the use of unmanned drones. A report entitled Living Under Drones, jointly authored by Stanford University and New York University, reviewed in The Atlantic, is unabashedly critical of the drone campaign in Pakistan. The report strongly argues that the US narrative of drone strikes, the supposed precise, accurate, and limited, is unequivocally false. The report provides 130 interviews and review of media reports on the civilian toll from drone strikes that is much, much higher than acknowledged, and that many problems and collateral damage go unreported. There is a consistent lack of transparency on the campaign in general. The serious negative consequences of drone strikes makes the claims of this narrative not only false, but deliberately misleading. The section in the report on the political blowback is well documented and raises the issue that in Pakistan, the use of drones is not only ineffective in stopping terrorism, but counterproductive and creating a psychological trauma among residents of the federally administered tribal areas and creating a pervasive environment of fear. Furthermore, despite the administration's claim that drone strikes have killed very few civilians, multiple independent reports confirm that the administration is severely downplaying the carnage from the strikes. It is impossible to obtain exact figures, of course, but a new study by Columbia Law School's Human Rights Institute finds that a number of Pakistani civilians killed in drone strikes is significantly and consistently underestimated. There are estimates as high as 98% of drone strike casualties are collateral damage, which means for every one suspected terrorist, about 50 innocents are killed. The Bureau of Investigative Journalism issued a report detailing how the CIA is deliberately targeting those who show up after an attack, such as rescuers and mourners, as part of a double tap strategy. Indeed, Jeremy Scahill's thorough reporting in The Nation constantly corroborates these policies and their blowback. U.S. drone strikes in Yemen are the primary source for al-Qaeda's presence in the Arabian Peninsula. Scahill notes that Obama's signature strikes, where targets are hit for displaying suspicious behavior, are backfiring and will boomerang back to us. The example of the targeted assassination of drone strike on Anwar al-Awlaki and his 16-year-old son, both of whom were U.S. citizens, raises other thorny issues vis-a-vis the legality of the strikes per se. The drone strike that killed al-Awlaki and Samir Khan, instead of neutralizing the threat of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, have conversely helped to make Yemen the new hotspot in the war on terror. The collateral damage in Yemen has only served to validate AQAP's ideology and contributes to anti-American sentiment that perpetuates the conditions favorable for extremism. Bad enough that the Yemeni government is battling an insurgency by the Houthi tribes in the north and a secessionist movement in the south, along with diminishing resources of oil and water. But all of this is pushing the newly elected president toward collapse that will not only contribute to AQA's power, but certainly will enhance instability. In Pakistan, there's a similar argument to be made with regard to drone attacks that have been destabilizing the Pakistani government. So much so that the New York Times has speculated that there could be a military coup by anti-US junior military officers in Pakistan. A Pew poll found that 74% of the people in Pakistan regard the US as their enemy, primarily because the strikes had quadrupled and due to the incident when Pakistanis were killed by American aircraft. Furthermore, as our own ambassador, US ambassador to Pakistan, Ann Patterson, has conveyed to lawmakers, Pakistan is refusing to cooperate with the US on either nuclear proliferation or safeguarding of their nuclear materials due to the antipathy that they feel because of the US drone campaign. This should be a cause for significant concern, given that Pakistan's nuclear stockpile is the world's fastest growing and least secure, according to Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. Another very troubling byproduct of the drone war in Pakistan is the threat to stability and any vestige of democracy. One of Pakistan's most senior diplomats told The Guardian of London in August that drone strikes were now undermining democracy. When the mission in the invasion of Iraq morphed from WMD to promoting democracy, to discover that the actions of the US government are actually undermining democracy is disconcerting, to say the least. In the same manner in which drone attacks have contributed to extremism in Yemen and in Pakistan as a result of drone strikes, the Pakistani Taliban is not only 4 or 5 times larger than it was, but the Pakistani intelligence agency issued a report claiming they were bigger than ever. Indeed, Senator John Kerry, soon to be sworn in as the next Secretary of State, while serving on the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, dubbed Afghanistan a sideshow compared with Pakistan, with 180 million people and nuclear weapons that pose a far greater threat to the U.S. national security interests than non-nuclear Afghanistan, with only 30 million people. Then there's the issue of the legality of drone strikes and targeted assassination, an issue far too long and complex for today's talk, but one that I do work on. The Justice Department and the newly confirmed National Security Council quite clearly need to examine this. According to Jus in Bello, the distinction of combatants and non-combatants and the issue of proportionality must be addressed. The complete lack of transparency and clear legal policy prevents the international community and the American public from assessing the legality of the drone strikes. Furthermore, from an international humanitarian law perspective and human rights focus, Pakistan's legal obligation to its citizens and other individuals within its territory must be raised. For even if Pakistan has given its consent to such strikes, obviating concerns of national sovereignty, Pakistan still has responsibility to protect the human rights of its citizens and those within its territory from extrajudicial execution and targeted assassination. Nevertheless, to say the doubts regarding the legality of drone strikes, be they in Pakistan, Yemen, or elsewhere, undermine the legitimacy of US efforts against extremism and raise the risk of civilian and consequences of blowback. Representative Dennis Kucinich and 10 members of the US House of Representatives have asked President Obama to explain the criteria for targeting drone strike victims, and more importantly, the legal justification for them, without which the drones constitute an undeclared war. On the floor of the US House of Representatives, Congressman Kucinich quoted Gore Vidal's Perpetual War for Perpetual Peace, forcibly saying that the administration's unrestricted use of drones has taken us into undeclared wars in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, Sudan, and who knows where else, destroying not only alleged militants, but making a direct hit on international law. He goes on to note, one nation's drones over another nation's airspace is an act of war. Joseph Nye, nevertheless, still believes that America can become a smart power again by investing in global public goods and providing things that people, governments of the world want that they've been unable to get in the absence of leadership. Development, public health, and coping with climate change are just a few examples of those. And I'll just end with this on soft power. Soft power advocates need to be more convincing that their particular strengths can advance the national well-being and be more Machiavellian about how to do so. The hard power advocates need to be willing to admit publicly what they admit in private or at conferences and side conversations, and that is that good diplomacy can prevent bad military conflicts. Distinguished diplomacy can make it unnecessary for the Pentagon to commit troops and risk soldiers' death and injury. Even with the weakness of current US diplomatic structures, the military needs to resist the temptation to do everything on its own. Instead, they should do something that may seem irrational from a bureaucratic perspective. They should advocate for additional budgetary resources for other agencies, such as development agencies. Unless we give the country the institutions, the ideas, and the policies America deserves, then our children and grandchildren will pay the cost of this generation's inability to wield power intelligently and strategically. In other words, to wield smart power. Thank you.